France 24 debate. We're looking at Britain's splendid isolation after that summit that took place in Brussels Thursday and Friday. We're talking about it with Conservative Member of Parliament Bill Cash, who is in London, Sarah Ludford, Liberal Democrat member of the European Parliament, is in Strasbourg in the east of France, and Thomas Clow, the Paris Bureau Chief of the European Council on Foreign Relations. A couple of comments for you, Thomas, from the France 24 debate Facebook page. First is one from Andrew from Otley in England, saying Cameron had no choice. The Eurozone has become increasingly anti-democratic in the last 6 months. They've imposed new prime ministers on Greece and Italy and now refuse to negotiate with the UK. The Swedes and the Czechs had better take note of this in their parliamentary deliberations. While Michael from Brampton in Ontario writes, this time the Germans have made puppets of the oldest civilizations in the West. Once again, as has happened time and again, Britain stands alone to fight for freedom, democracy, and its people. This time, though, I'm not sure they'll win. Not everyone, though, agrees with those points. On Twitter, Al Jazz follower Jack Point says, on commenting on the debate in the House of Commons, where one British MP said, we are not the lifeboat of the Euro financial market. He said, no, I'd say they're rather the leak instead. Thomas Clow, we were sort of saying how last week the mood shifted from Germany bashing to Brit bashing when it came to this summit. There is quite a lot of acrimony in the comments we're getting, a lot of finger pointing at this point over who runs Europe.
You see, the first two commenters raise, I think, an important point, but they gave the wrong answers. It would have been much better, particularly for the sake of democracy in Europe, not to have an intergovernmental arrangement, as we're now going to have, because Britain vetoed the possibility of a treaty reform, but to have a treaty reform including everyone, because that would have enabled the Brussels institutions, including the European Parliament, to play a full role. And of course, the answer to the present crisis is yes, to have a more common, a more integrated management of the Eurozone's economic and budgetary policies. But if you give more power to Brussels, you also must make that power more accountable. And you can involve national parliaments, but you cannot have 27 national chambers monitoring what happens in Brussels. It's just not efficient. So you need to give more powers to the European Parliament, make that stronger so that it can control what the executive does in Brussels. Now, by vetoing the treaty, David Cameron has weakened that possibility. And by pushing the rest of Europe into an intergovernmental way of managing its affairs, it has fed a dynamic which we've seen, a negative dynamic, which we've seen emerge during this crisis. And that is France and Germany, in a sense, becoming the main captains on the bridge, because you can't have, of course, 26 or 17 captains squabbling before they take an agreement. And within that couple, Germany being the more powerful partner because of its strong economy. It's not a good way to manage the EU or the Eurozone. And one of the negative outcomes of the Brussels summit is that this tendency runs now the risk of being reinforced. And that's a price which David Cameron's stance and Britain's stance is now exacting from the EU and from Europe. It's wholly counterproductive in my view.
In any case, what's certain is that to point out that how much of a hard sell all this has become. The British tabloids have been going full throttle on the heels of the summit. We can perhaps show you some of the headlines there. The Daily Express, the Daily Mail, the day he put Britain first. Last Saturday's edition of The Sun, dressing David Cameron up as Winston Churchill with the title Up Yours. And the same Sun, which famously back in 1990, there's the old headline, urged Britons to bawl at Gaul and saying, up yours, Delors. At the time, Jacques Delors was the president of the European Commission. I want to put this question to you, Sarah Ludford. How much does the press, with that tone, how much does that headline from back in 1990, how much does that still dictate the tone of the discussion when it comes to Europe today?
Well, quite a lot, and I'm afraid Europhobic MPs like Bill Cash and the tabloid press rather sort of feed on each other and reinforce each other. And you have to remember that Quite a lot of the press in Britain is foreign-owned, including by Rupert Murdoch, who certainly doesn't want the EU to get its act together on things like competition and common sort of taxation policies. And I didn't say common rate, Bill Cash, I meant common sort of assessments. You know, and it's easy. It's such an easy thing to do to, you know, to be xenophobic and bash the foreigners and so on. And I'm afraid we have had a very bad press like this for many years now. But can I just comment on that opinion poll which said that 60% of people backed Cameron? There may be a sort of initial thrill about the sort of nationalistic attitude, the bulldog Britain and all that, but I'm not sure that people are going to be quite so happy with the result. Isolation is not actually splendid, and when they come to their senses, I think the British people will understand that their jobs, in many cases, in their companies, depend on selling into the European Union. And I hope some of the company bosses, not only in the city but in the rest of the economy, will actually make that clear. And the trade unions. We need to hear those people sort of speaking up for just how much is at stake for Britain in the EU. This does not mean submerging your national interests any more than the Germans do or the French do, but it means, you know, getting together and working out common compromises that everybody can live with. And normally Britain is not bad at engaging in that way. I mean, this is just a spectacular disaster in terms of an inability to come up with a treaty for 27. That will be a good deal for Britain, and I hope it's still retrievable.
Bill Cash, the UK has changed in those times. Now with low-budget air carriers, more and more people vacation on the continent, more and more people live abroad. Is Europe, is the UK Europhobic to the degree that it sometimes seems like it when you look at those newspaper headlines on this side of the channel?
Well, I mean, first of all, I certainly don't take my views from the newspapers. In fact, Ed Miliband, the leader of the opposition, actually singled me out in his remarks as being the person who he was going to blame. All I can say is that I have campaigned vigorously and consistently since Maastricht against the centralisation. And what Sarah Ludford and I'm afraid the Euro fanatics don't understand and won't listen to is the mess that Europe has got itself into is the result of the manner in which the existing treaties have been put together. It's hopeless to say that people like me are actually wrong when quite clearly everything that we predicted has come true. What I am saying is that we are looking for solutions. We do believe in trade and political cooperation. We don't believe in European government. We do believe in democracy. And actually, the trouble that we've got is coming from a complete difference of attitude of mind. Mr. Barroso goes on talking about we want more Europe, not less, we want more integration, and yet it's quite clear from opinion polls, and by the way, not just in the United Kingdom. I mean, there was a referendum in France, in Belgium, in Holland, in Denmark, and in Ireland. They all said no. And then the moment they said no, they then put on all the money, turned on the tap, and then tried to push them and bully them into changing their positions. The fact is that this is essentially an undemocratic, idealistic fantasy world. That's the problem. And we're not standing alone. We're standing up for common sense, for reality, and a lot of people throughout the whole of the rest of Europe agree with us.
Thomas Clough? What percentage of people in the rest of Europe agree with that?
Well, I think it's a minority. It's a substantial minority in some countries, 15, 20, 25%, maybe as much as 30% in a few rare examples, but I think under 25 in most countries. What Mr. Cash should take note of is that, to many people's considerable surprise, all the governments, with the exception of the United Kingdom, the British government, in Brussels decided to join forces, three need to consult their parliaments, and engage together in this new endeavour to make the budgetary rules for the EU, for the Eurozone, stronger, and other countries participating stronger and more intrusive. So this is a situation where Britain...
But it hasn't gone to the voters yet.
It hasn't gone to the voters yet. And we cannot be sure of the outcome of the ratification process that will now have to start in some countries. Yes, there are countries where there is a substantial minority of the population that is structurally hostile to European integration. And there are countries where if you ask a certain question at a given point in time through a referendum, you might get a majority against it.
Can I come back in again on that,
is
please?
Absolutely possible. But to say that the majority of people across the EU and their leaders are against integration, I think is just plain wrong.
Bill Cash.
Well, could I just say, if I may, could I just come back on that?
Go ahead, Bill Cash.
Yes. Could I just say, actually, I mean, we know for a fact, because opinion polls in Germany demonstrated that 80% were against the bailout arrangements, yet the Bundestag, which is actually run on the basis of party list systems and proportional representation, with a great deal of control by the party's leadership, which is the elite, that the people in the Bundestag voted by 99% or 98%.
But then, how do you explain then that in Germany the FDP party, which is right now in a rather Eurosceptic sense, is losing ground, and the Greens, which are Europhile, are gaining ground? And this in regional elections.
I gave you the example of the bailouts, but I also gave the example of the referendums when they took place. And as somebody just said, we don't yet know how the ratification process, if there is a treaty, would actually go through. And you have to remember that there are an enormous number of people who haven't yet been exposed to the debates. And there are protests, there are riots going on in many countries. There's 47% of the young people in Spain and Greece unemployed. I think that the whole of this ratification process could easily go completely off the wall. And I'll add one other thing, which is that the whole of the democratic decision-making process in the United Kingdom would definitely vote no if there was a referendum in the United Kingdom.
Oh.
Sarah Ludford.
I disagree. I contest that. But if Bill Cash has his way, maybe we'll get a chance to find out. And I will fight extremely hard alongside my Liberal Democrat colleagues, of course, for a yes vote. Do you know, one of the ironies of the position of people like Bill Cash is that he goes on about the overbearing regulation from Brussels, but what he and his ilk want is to be like Norway or Switzerland, i.e. in the so-called European Economic Area, not members of the EU, but taking part in all Brussels regulation and subject to it. That's why they're called fax democracies. They take their instructions on the fax from Brussels, and so you have to accept everything that's decided in Brussels without any voice in the Council of Ministers or in the European Parliament. Quite how that increases the famous national sovereignty, which Bill Cash wants to hoard rather than pool with other states to be stronger together. I have never understood, and I've never heard a decent explanation.
Could I answer
of
that
how
one
being
as well?
Like that actually improves. You are helpless. You just have to take everything if you want to trade into the EU.
Very briefly, Bill Cash, because we must move on.
Explain it to me, Bill,
very simply,
I have no idea.
this talk about sovereignty is actually about who makes the laws. The laws are made by the people themselves through their parliamentary representatives on the basis of promises which are made in general elections. That is the whole point of why people go to the secret ballot and cast their votes. If they're then overridden by decisions that are taken contrary to manifesto promises and also by majority vote of other countries, and if the result of that is that your economy declines because you can't grow from the massive growth that you need...
You're not answering the question, Bill. You're not
really
answering the question. How would the status like Norway or Switzerland be better?
I didn't say that. I said that we want an association of nation states. It's nothing to do with Norway,
but
Switzerland,
you want to be
Norway.
part
let me please.
You want to be traded into the EU.
Let me break in here. Let me break in here at this
laws.
point now. I just want to bring it for, again, a lot of our viewers who are not in Britain and not in Europe. I just want to remind viewers that back in 1979, the UK had a new prime minister, and at the time, she threw down the gauntlet to Europe. Let's listen to what she had to say.
One of the difficulties here has been to get clear the nature of the problem. We are not asking for a penny piece of community money for Britain. What we are asking is for a very large amount of our own money back.
Now, 5 years later, Margaret Thatcher got her wish as she negotiated a rebate on UK dues to Brussels. This at a European Council summit in 1984 in Fontainebleau outside of Paris. Thomas Clow, that strategy, Britain's done very well by it.
Britain's done remarkably well by that strategy, and what has come to a head in Brussels is that for the first time ever, rather than negotiating some kind of opt-out or special treatment within a process of EU treaty reform, David Cameron manoeuvred himself and the EU in a situation where all the member states, apart from the UK, decided to go away and do their own thing within the EU, and where Britain ended up
How is it different this time?
It's different because it is quite possible that this is the beginning of a development where Britain, being in a minority of one, gets permanently frozen out of many very important, particularly in terms of the economy and possibly the management of the single market, decisions which the others are going to take. The other leaders, the other 26 leaders probably, are going to meet once a month, far more often than all the 27 will meet. That is a position which could become very difficult for Britain further down the road. And during the summit, David Cameron raised the prospect of trying to stop the 26 from using European institutions to make their cooperation work and be more forceful. Now again, that was an act of almost open aggression or hostility. It was also totally inconsistent with the fact that it was the British government which rightly called on the Eurozone to develop into something like a fiscal union to secure the survival of the euro and the efficiency and the cohesion, economically speaking, of the Eurozone as a whole.
All right, so
that was a very striking thing to say, and inconsistent, hostile, and the danger is that this really heralds the development of a deep split, possibly between all of the EU, save Britain, and the United Kingdom, which would be, I think, a very negative development certainly for the United Kingdom, possibly for the EU as a whole.
Very briefly, because we're almost out of time, Bill Cash, do you fear that those financial services may migrate to the continent, to Ireland?
I think it's far more likely that if they were to continue the way they are, they would migrate to New York or Chicago or somewhere. Actually, I don't think that the other continental centres have got the skills or the initiative or the innovatory skills to be able to do the job as well as they do in London or, for that matter, in other parts of the world. But I think the real question is much, much deeper than just the financial services.
Much deeper.
I think it's much, much more to do, as I've said repeatedly, with democracy. It's to do with freedom of choice in the marketplace and in the ballot box.
All right, Bill Cash, I want to thank you for joining us from London. I want to thank Sarah Ludford for being with us today from Strasbourg. And I want to thank you, Thomas Clow, for being with us here. And thank you for being with us in the France 24 debate. Stay with us. We're going to have more on this situation and how the markets are digesting the news out of Brussels and London. Business is next here on France 24.